The fall of the Reich, the final days of Hitler's war. By late 1944, the walls were closing in on Nazi Germany. From the west, Allied forces were crossing the rivers and farmland of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was rolling like a tidal wave, flattening everything in its path. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was disintegrating, one crumbling city at a time. The world was witnessing the death throes of the most brutal regime in modern history. The Allied advance into Germany began in earnest in the autumn of 1944. After liberating Paris and breaking out of the Normandy beachhead, American, British, and Canadian troops surged across Western Europe. They crossed the Siegfried Line, Germany's last defensive barrier, and began pushing into the heart of the fatherland. The German cities of Aachen, Cologne, and Bonn fell one after the other. Still, resistance remained fierce. Hitler had ordered his troops to fight street by street, house by house, to the last man. For the German people, defeat was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Yet the regime demanded total sacrifice. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, a relentless Soviet juggernaut was smashing into eastern Germany. The Red Army, having bled and clawed its way westward since Stalingrad, had crossed Poland and reached the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin. What followed was a brutal and merciless campaign. Soviet troops uncovered the death camps of Auschwitz and Majdanek, witnessing firsthand the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust. Fueled by vengeance, many soldiers exacted terrible retribution on the German population as they advanced. For the Nazis, this was the nightmare they had created, and it was finally coming home. Then came a final desperate gamble. In December 1944, as Allied forces paused to regroup for a final push, Hitler launched a surprise counteroffensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes. Known as the Battle of the Bulge, it was Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Under cover of winter fog, over 200,000 German troops and hundreds of tanks slammed into unsuspecting American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, turning the tide one last time. For days, the fate of the Western Front hung in the balance. American units, including the famously stubborn 101st Airborne at Bastogne, were surrounded and cut off. Supplies ran low, weather grounded Allied planes, but the line never broke. As skies cleared, Allied aircraft struck back. Reinforcements arrived. The German attack ran out of fuel, time, and men. By January 1945, the bulge had been flattened, and the last hope of Nazi victory had been extinguished. In April 1945, the noose around Berlin tightened. American and British troops had crossed the Rhine, and the Soviets were closing in from the east. In the ruined capital, Adolf Hitler, once the fiery architect of empire, now sat trembling in an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above him, Berlin was being pulverized by artillery. The once great city was now a graveyard of dreams, choked in fire, rubble, and blood. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops just blocks away raised the red flag over the Reichstag, Hitler ended his life with a pistol to his head. His longtime companion, Eva Braun, swallowed cyanide beside him. Their bodies were hastily burned in the garden outside the bunker as the Third Reich collapsed above them. The man who had brought the world to war died in silence and defeat, buried in the ashes of his own madness. Just 1 week later, on May 7, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, German generals signed the unconditional surrender. The next day, May 8th, was declared Victory in Europe Day. In London, Paris, New York, and Moscow, people flooded the streets, dancing, weeping, embracing strangers. Church bells rang, flags waved. After 6 long, agonizing years, after tens of millions dead and entire cities erased, the war in Europe was finally over. But in Germany, there was no celebration. Only silence, smoke, and the haunting realization of what had been done in their name. The Nazi nightmare was over. The world had survived. But it would never be the same. Inferno in the Pacific, the final fury of World War II. While Europe erupted in celebration on VE Day, the war in the Pacific raged on with no end in sight. The Japanese Empire, once a seemingly unstoppable force that had conquered territory from Burma to the Philippines, was now on the defensive. But if the Allies thought Japan would surrender easily, they were mistaken. The road to Tokyo would be paved not just with strategy and steel, but with fire, devastation, and moral reckoning. The Allied strategy was called island hopping, a methodical campaign to seize key islands across the Pacific, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and isolating them into irrelevance. Each island was a stepping stone toward the Japanese mainland, but each one was also a battlefield soaked in blood. The jungles were thick, the terrain unforgiving, and the enemy fanatically entrenched. At Guadalcanal, the US Marines clashed with Japanese soldiers in a 6-month struggle that defined the brutal nature of the Pacific theater. In Tarawa, defenders fought to the last man. At Saipan, civilians, indoctrinated by imperial propaganda, hurled themselves off cliffs to avoid capture. Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each island became a name synonymous with carnage. On Iwo Jima, it took 36 days and nearly 7,000 American deaths to secure a tiny volcanic rock. And Okinawa, the last major battle of the war, claimed over 200,000 lives, including tens of thousands of civilians. The deeper the Allies pushed, the more ferociously Japan resisted. The message was clear: if they would not surrender these islands, how would they ever surrender their homeland? Faced with this unyielding resistance, the United States turned to strategic bombing. In the spring of 1945, the skies over Japan darkened with American B-29 superfortresses, armed not with high explosives, but with incendiary bombs designed to ignite entire cities. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, Tokyo became a firestorm. Over 330 bombers dropped napalm and petroleum-based explosives, engulfing wooden neighborhoods in flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, whipped into a maelstrom by the wind. In just 6 hours, over 100,000 civilians were burned alive. It was the deadliest single air raid in history, even surpassing the devastation at Dresden. Survivors described the sound of skin peeling off, of bodies stuck together in the melted streets, of mothers clutching the charred remains of children. The firebombing of Tokyo reduced a metropolis to ashes, and it was only the beginning. 67 Japanese cities would suffer similar fates in the weeks to come. Still, Japan refused to surrender, its military leaders believing in the Bushido Code of honor unto death, prepared for a mainland invasion that would cost millions of lives. In the eyes of the Allies, the longer Japan resisted, the greater the toll would be. And so the United States made a fateful decision, one that would change the course of history forever. On August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. In seconds, the atomic blast unleashed the power of 15,000 tons of TNT. A blinding flash turned day to night. A fireball reached 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. People were vaporized instantly. Those farther from the epicenter staggered through the ruins, their skin hanging in ribbons, their shadows burned into the walls. 80,000 people died that day. Thousands more would die in agony from radiation poisoning in the weeks and years to follow. But still, no surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 in an instant. The cities were gone, obliterated in mushroom clouds that pierced the heavens. For the first time in history, mankind had wielded the power to erase entire cities in a single moment. And this time, the message landed. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito crackled over Japanese radios, many hearing him speak for the first time. His tone was soft, almost inaudible, as he told a shattered nation that it must endure the unendurable. Japan had surrendered. On September 2, 1945, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender in front of representatives from the Allied powers. The scene was both somber and symbolic. Military officers in crisp uniforms, the wreckage of war all around them, and a single pen stroke marking the end of a conflict that had consumed the world. VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, had arrived. The war was finally over. After 6 years, over 70 million deaths, and the dawn of the nuclear age, humanity stood at a crossroads. The Pacific Campaign was not only a fight across oceans and islands, it was a confrontation with the darkest depths of human endurance, cruelty, and courage. It ended not with cheers, but with a hushed and sobering silence as the world looked at the ruins and asked, "What had we done?" The war that never truly ended, the aftermath of World War II. The guns had fallen silent, the cities lay in ruin. The dead could no longer speak, and the survivors were left to rebuild a world they barely recognized. World War II had ended, but in many ways, the chaos was just beginning. In the shadow of atomic fire and genocide, the victors gathered, not in celebration, but in urgency. The world had burned twice in less than 30 years. If there was any lesson carved into the charred bones of Warsaw, Hiroshima, and Dresden, it was this: peace could no longer be left to chance. And so, in 1945, from the ashes of a broken world, the United Nations was born. The UN was not just a diplomatic forum, it was a moral vow. A vow to protect the weak, to mediate conflict, and to never again allow nations to spiral into global war. With its charter signed in San Francisco by 50 nations, it promised a new order based on cooperation, not conquest. But even as the ink dried, dark clouds gathered again. This time not from bombs, but from ideology. Before a new world could be built, the old one demanded justice. In Nuremberg, the shattered heart of Nazi Germany, a courtroom was assembled unlike any in history. The Nuremberg trials brought the architects of the Holocaust, the generals of extermination, and the bureaucrats of death before a tribunal of the world. For the first time, crimes against humanity was given legal meaning. Nazi officials sat behind glass, forced to witness the evidence. The camps, the corpses, the testimonies of survivors. The world heard the words Auschwitz and gas chamber and would never forget them. But as the trials progressed, the alliance that had defeated Hitler began to fracture. East and West no longer trusted each other. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies of necessity, became enemies of ideology. A new kind of war emerged, one without battlefields, but with spies, proxy wars, and nuclear brinkmanship. This was the beginning of the Cold War, a conflict of shadows that would divide the world for nearly half a century. And at its center stood a new and terrifying power, the atom bomb. With the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, mankind had entered the nuclear age. For the first time in human history, we had created a weapon that could annihilate our species in minutes. The arms race began almost immediately. What had once ended a war now ensured that the next one could never be fought. At least, not if we hoped to survive. Nowhere was the post-war divide more visible than in Germany, a nation quite literally split in half. Berlin, once the capital of the Reich, was now a city of barbed wire and walls, divided between the democratic West and the communist East. But the fracture spread far beyond Germany. Eastern Europe, liberated by the Soviets, became a collection of puppet states behind what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. The dream of liberation had given way to a new kind of occupation. Elsewhere, the war had weakened empires beyond repair. The once mighty colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, were bankrupt and exhausted. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, people began to rise, demanding the freedom they had fought and died for. The decolonization movements had begun. From India to Indonesia, From Algeria to Kenya, the world's oppressed refused to return to servitude. War had torn the illusion of European invincibility apart, and the age of empire was dying. World War II ended with treaties, tribunals, and tears. But its echoes never truly faded. It redrew the map, rewired the balance of power, and redefined what humanity was capable of, for better or worse. Over 75 million people perished. Entire cities vanished. Families were erased. Yet from that inferno emerged the modern world, scarred, sobered, and forever changed. The war did not simply conclude, it transformed. It birthed the nuclear age, ignited the Cold War, accelerated human rights, and forced a reckoning with the darkest corners of civilization. It was not just a conflict between nations, it was a collision between what humanity is and what it must never become again. We remember it not just to honor the dead, but to warn the living. Thanks for watching World History Z, where the past meets the present. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, keep exploring the world of history.